Imagine, a podcast series by Imagine Theatre.
Yes, hello again, I hope you're well. I can't believe we're into the second month of the year already, and this is episode 98 of this series. This time, we're going to take a look at scenic design in pantomime.
For more information, go to their website at www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.
Now, in the last episode, we had the latest in our occasional series looking at the popular pantomime titles, and I discussed Sleeping Beauty with director and academic Dr. Robert Marsden and actress and director Mari Bryan. Don't worry if you missed that or any of the other previous episodes, they are all still available. So far, if you've missed them, we talked with celebrities and backstage team members, practitioners and academics about how pantomime is produced, its history and its future. So make sure you check them out where you normally get your podcasts from, and don't forget to subscribe to the series so that you don't miss any future episodes. So again, this time we're going to explore the world of scenic design with a man who's a highly experienced production designer and art director for film, television, event production and of course the stage. Since 1985, his company, 3D Creation Studios, have specialised in creating incredible sets for children's theatre, musicals, theme parks, TV, movies and numerous shows on Chroma Pier. But it's his work on pantomime that we're concentrating on today with Ian Westbrook. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Martin.
That's quite a CV. Let's go back to the very beginning. When young Ian Westbrook was still at school, was it a love of fine art or theatre? What came first?
Seeing at the age of 7 my older sister in the cast of Pirates of Penzance at her high school, and the art department was very, very good, and they produced some wonderful pieces of scenery and props. And I remember going backstage after seeing one of the school productions and picking up what I thought was a real pirate sword, and it was made out of plywood, and it was light, and I was fascinated, and then going behind the set, looking at what I thought was really beautifully painted rocks, only to find out it was hardboard. And I just fell in love with it, and I just thought, this is what I want to do. And I just thought it was great fun. And being on the coast in Great Yarmouth, where we live, there was a lot of summer seasons. We had 8 or 9 shows going during a summer season then, and I was lucky enough to become a stagehand at the age of 14, shifting scenery for the Britannia Pier and Wellington Piers in Great Yarmouth. That taught me so much, and I made some contacts. So I went to art school, and I carried on being a stagehand through art school for extra money in the summer. But there was a production and set designer called Saxon Lucas. Now Saxon worked for Bernard Delfont, and Lord Delfont had a big studios down in London, and Saxon was a great mentor. He's a huge 6'6" chap. Very, very BBC sort of voice. He said, why not come over to the studios and help paint the scenery? And I just thought, yes, why not? And so I was only 16. So went to London, and it was a bit like Dick Whittington looking for streets of gold. These very cold, drafty scenic workshops with these huge backcloths, and my first job was to paint the white priming on the cloths, which is an art, because if you get it wrong, the scenic painting, which goes next, is very difficult. So I spent weeks just painting things white. But it taught me the basics, and it was almost like an apprenticeship in scene painting and set design. And I would see Saxon. Bernard Delfont would phone the workshops on a Monday, and he'd say, we've just signed up Shirley Bassey for the Palladium on Saturday or Sunday, whenever it was. He said she's going to do blah blah blah, and Saxon would have we'd have all these backcloths primed, and he'd sketch out a design. He said, right lads, draw this up whilst I colour it in, and that's how we did it. We had a week to do these very elaborate cloths, and they were rolled up, taken by a lorry into the Palladium, and when they were hung, they would dry. They used to dry during the day whilst it was lit, ready for the evening show. And that's how quick everything was. So I learnt how to paint very, very quickly.
So as a boy, following that performance of Pirates of Penzance and building up that love of theatre and wanting to work in it, that's one thing, of course. But were you aware of the skills that were necessary? And did you have an artistic leaning? Did you enjoy art at school?
Yes, that was one of the only things I was very good at, really. Not being a terrible academic, I was okay at English, and I liked the sciences. But art and anything creative seemed to tick the boxes. And my father was and grandfather were quite artistic, although they were never allowed to get a job in it. My father used to say, well, okay, go to art college, but if you don't make it within 3 years, you're coming into the family business, and I didn't want to do that, so that was a spur.
And in television, you've worked on so many fabulous shows, under the sort of Delfont organisation, for household names like Cannon and Ball and Lenny Henry and Dick Emery, who was perfect for pantomime, but obviously the two worlds are very different in terms of design. We'll talk about theatre and pantomime in particular in a bit more detail in a moment. But television, as you said with the Shirley Bassey story, is obviously much more immediate and almost a different discipline, isn't it?
Film, TV and theatre are, although related, are completely different ways of working. There's different languages, a completely different way of even thinking. With the theatre, everything has to work and is real in real time. But in television and film, you could start halfway through the script or the show and record a piece. You might then jump to the end section and then you'll start with the beginning. So it's all jumbled up and you don't really get the kind of idea of a flow. Even as a designer, we would, for television and film, especially if there's different set locations, we would be always one step, or hopefully two if we were lucky, 2 steps in advance of what was actually happening on the studio or location floor. So we'd get the set ready, and they'd be recording whatever they needed to do in that set whilst we were getting the second set ready, and that saved time. So it is a completely different way of working.
Of course, for movies and television, very often the set will be used once and then, discarded or reused in a different way somehow. And the difference as well is that obviously for theatre, the audience is not as close as a camera might be to a film or television scene, and cameras are less forgiving, aren't they?
They are. With television especially, you have to be very, very exact and use real things as possible, props, cutlery, etc., etc. Not so much in the theatre. And in pantomime it's completely different anyway, because it's a complete fantasy land. With film, it's more a section of set or props, and the rest can be now CGI. But when I was started, the CGI work was very, very crude and very in its infancy. I remember painting very long dioramas of a landscape which were on 2 rollers, and the stage crew would roll this scene as for example, if you were in a car, the actors would be static in a studio, in a car, the camera would be on the bonnet, and the background would be moving, and that would be a hand-painted scene on a very, very long piece of canvas. That's how old I've been doing this. It's almost Keystone Cops.
Times have certainly changed, and I'm not a film or television expert, but of course, before CGI and before green screen and all of that, very often you would paint some scenery, particularly for animated movies, on cells, within the film itself, wouldn't you?
Yes, I remember doing children's programs. We used to paint on glass, on sheets of vertical glass, a landscape, or if there was a photograph and we'd need a castle or a spaceship or whatever it was, we'd paint that in minute detail onto glass, and then the camera would look through the glass and then into the background, and from the television point of view and the viewer, it looked as if the castle was on the hill. or wherever it was.
It is incredible. In terms of theatre, you've done all sorts of stuff, haven't you? At many different theatres, from Shakespeare to Brecht and, of course, pantomime. Do you remember your first big theatre project when you had left school and finished your training at Nottingham Trent University and so on?
Did some work at Nottingham Playhouse with Alan Miller Bamford. There was a few pantos there, but I went down from, when I graduated from Nottingham, I went to Plymouth Theatre Royal, and the lovely Terry Parsons, who is still around and still designing shows, took me under his wing, and I was in the props and paint department then, and I learnt so much from Terry's designs. I think we did a Snow White and a Peter Pan there, and the detail that he put on his drawings I've always sort of remembered, because the workshops would look at Terry's designs. Everything was there. All the questions were answered or written down, and I thought that's the way to do it.
The two theatres you mentioned, two of many that you've worked at, but both with fabulous traditions of pantomime. Nottingham, of course, with Kenneth Allen Taylor, and back in the 80s, a very young Susie McKenna as Principal Boy. And
Yes.
that tradition lives on today. Likewise, at other venues across the country. So, do you remember the first pantomime you ever worked on?
I think it was an amateur production, actually, for our local theatre, the Galston Pavilion Theatre, which is an Edwardian theatre, and I think it was a Humpty Dumpty.
Mm-hmm.
This was what I was literally still at our college, I think, and that was the first one, but the first professional one as a designer would have been at Plymouth, and that would have been Snow White.
Do you remember how much you learnt from that very first one?
Yes. As you make a lot of mistakes, and I even now, you forget something, or you misread a plan and something doesn't quite fit. I can't remember. I mean, it's 40 years ago, so I must have made loads of mistakes. But it looked all right at the end, so I think that was the main thing.
I tell you what, you learn so much more in reality than you ever learn at art school, I'm sure. But the thing that always amazes me, and it's the same with mural painters as well, you know, if you're painting cloths particularly, or portals for that matter, and you're up close on a step ladder or whatever to paint it, how you can have that eye of an audience who are 50 to 100 feet away.
That's the trick. It can be learned, and you do have to learn it. Well, all our designs are scaled. In the old days it was 1 to 24, which is ½ inch to the foot. Now it's 1 to 25, which is not too dissimilar. The scenic painters would measure the design on a scale ruler, and then it would be enlarged 25 times. And so a lot of it is just measuring. And drawing up is the hardest thing. Without that becoming correct, then the whole cloth or set would look appalling. And so that's the hardest process, is actually drawing it up. We normally put a grid. So on that, say if we've got a backcloth, we'd square this in metre squares with very thin chalk lines, and then we use these as a map to then enlarge from the design with scale rulers. It takes forever.
But it's absolutely necessary, as you say. And the thing that you have to get right as well is the perspective, or sometimes, very often, forced perspective, to make something like a castle look so much bigger to the human eye than it actually is in reality. And that forced perspective is vital, isn't it?
As a designer, we played all sorts of tricks, like perspectives and distortions and things like that. A lot of designers now are using computer-aided work, CAD drawings, Photoshop, Illustrator, all those sort of digital programs, and of course that is highly technical, and you can get some fantastic results. I prefer still doing everything by hand, because I've got, especially for pantomimes, because most pantos and most theatre scenery is still painted by hand, and it transfers better, I think, from the design into the reality. in my opinion anyway.
And unlike much of the film and television work that you've done, realism isn't always necessary in theatre, is it? Particularly in pantomime, where the sets, the costumes and everything else are all there to enhance that feeling of fantasy and fairy tale.
Oh, definitely. I mean, when I start to design, I always start with the portals, which are the main element of any show. That frames what goes on stage, and depending on what the show is, I will go and research, use real life architecture, take photographs, all sorts of things. I'll take references from reality and then transfer them in and twist them and adapt to whichever design I'm doing. So, for example, if I'm doing a Cinderella ballroom, then I'd be looking at Rococo scrolls or Baroque interiors to get a feel for that sort of very ornate architecture. If I'm doing something like Jack and the Beanstalk, then there'd be looking at plants and beans and that sort of thing. Everything is different. Each one is different.
And just as an aside, talking of ballrooms, I think you, as part of your company, recreated the Blackpool Tower ballroom, didn't you?
Oh yes, yes. That was fun.
And the detail was incredible. If you don't mind me saying, that must
Yes.
have been a labour of love.
It was, but it was worth it.
Let's talk about your role then now, because and we'll talk in a moment about how things have changed. But let's say we're in January and you have a panto coming up next Christmas with a brand new set design. How early do you get involved, and how does the project progress?
Well, for Imagine Theatres, I've been asked to design for Coventry Belgrade their Sleeping Beauty, and we start next week. So Ian Lachlan, who is writing, directing, and starring in that Coventry Belgrade show, is furiously writing a synopsis and scene list as we speak, hopefully. And by the end of the week, I'm hoping that we'll get the first sort of ideas of what he was looking for. And what I'll do is read this and do some outline sketches. So the first thing I do is almost like a storyboard, which is going back to my film and TV days. You trying to small little rectangles of almost like cartoons, which show scene by scene. Then I'll try and get some ideas for the portals. And once I've got the frame of the stage, the portals in my head, then everything works in there, because what you don't want to do is build or design something that's either too big or too small for the stage. And you've got to also bear in mind when I'm designing anything is that it's got to be transported. So it's got to be small enough sections to go into a lorry and even into the theatre. One of my very first Anglia TV shows, I remember building it in my father's garage. They didn't know this at the time. This is when I really first started. I didn't have a workshop, and it was Tales of the Unexpected. I built this all in sections, but some of the things I couldn't actually get out of my father's garage because I'd built them too big. So I then immediately had to cut them in half, and then I realised, right, okay, I can't get them into the van. So
one thing that people talk about in pantomime is, breaking down the fourth wall, and very often they talk about that in terms of the performers, the baddie, the comic, the dame in particular, addressing the audience and so on. One way that many theatres do that as well, and the Belgrade is one of them, not every, but many theatres, sort of draw the audience in, because there's less of a sort of line between the actual stage and the audience, and they do that by dressing the proscenium arch and
Yes.
and using the front apron of the stage for set as well. Is that something, I know that you've done that at the Belgrade, but is that something that is also part of the initial discussion?
Oh yes, I mean the Belgrade Coventry has, I would say, a quarter of the stage space is in the audience. A large lump of set is put in front of the proscenium arch. I transferred this idea to the London Palladium when we were doing the pantomimes there. We did 6 there, and I wanted to increase the set area, and so we decorated and themed the proscenium arch and brought that in to the audience, including the orchestra pit. So everything had a uniform feel to it, and it made the audience connect to the actual location and the set and the show. The fashion started in the early 80s with Cats and Les Mis, and those sort of John Napier designs. And of course Starlight Express, the original, is a classic example, but bringing in the whole set into the audience. And it's very, very successfully done in 2 current West End shows, Moulin Rouge and Cabaret at the Kit Kat Club.
Yeah, and of course Guys and Dolls very much did that, now closed of course. So Ian Lachlan will give you an idea of a synopsis. He might say to you, in the slosh scene we want a chute for pies to come down or something like that. When will you actually start working on the physical set?
Once I've got an idea, we'll send these sketches off to Ian or to the director, and normally I get sort of feedback. I'll have a conversation over the phone. We talk, say, hours on end, going through scene by scene and discussing various options and various styles and things like that. And once I've done that, I just start drawing up. I do it to scale because I find that it's easier to get everything right and work out all the technical problems and the sizes if I do everything to scale on the drawing board. So I start, rather than just scribble away and then you have to revisit, I'll work quite meticulously. So that's how I start. I've like to start with the portals, and then once I've got those in place and they work, then everything can fit around that or inside those portal frames.
So we talked about dressing the proscenium. You've got the portals and 4, maybe 5 cloths, something like that?
Oh, for example, like Coventry, there would be about over 30 A2 size design sheets that goes into that, and it takes, even if I manage to do one every 2, maybe 3 days, there's a good 3 months' work involved in a pantomime.
And then in the workshop itself, when you're actually getting to the actual cloths and the physical portals themselves, is that September time or earlier?
No, much earlier. Coventry, Belgrade, they really want to start their in-house panto in May and get it built over the summer, because obviously they've got other shows coming in and out. But for example, when I used to do the London Palladium sets, for the pantomime sets that we used to design and build, we'd start in January, and I'd try to get the designs finished by May and priced and signed off by the end of May, beginning of June, and then we'd start. And we would take most of the summer to paint and construct all the sets ready for November. I would always make a point of, if I was building a set, I'd always want to finish at least 2 or 3 weeks before the fit up. Then we could check it. Things were able to be double checked, packed properly, and then of course by that time the show would be in rehearsals, so you'd get rehearsal notes and say, oh, this door needs changing, we need extra whatever it is, or we've got a chariot now, can you build a chariot? So that always gave us some time, but that had to be micromanaged throughout the summer to get it done on time and without any problems.
Well, you are an award winner both in pantomime for the Palladium, the Cinderella staging at the Palladium, with British Pantomime Award for that.
Oh, yes.
Nominations for the Olivier's. Lots of people will have seen your shows at Cromer Pier, and you've been awarded by Norfolk Arts for that as well. Literally millions of people, I'm not exaggerating, will have seen your work on film, television and stage. But we talked at the beginning about how things have changed, and in terms of pantomime, I guess the biggest change in recent years has been digital sets, and in many ways Imagine have been pioneering that. But in terms of the sets that you work on, how much has changed in the way that they are created and painted and so on?
Amazingly, the skills of a scenic painter are still very much the same, but with digital work, a lot of backcloths can be designed digitally, and then there's now facilities to print large-scale format canvases, and so that's taken that side of the traditional backcloth painting out. Even with scenery flats, fabric can be printed with a design, and then it's just stretched over these frames, profiles cut out and whatever, so that has sped up the process in manufacturing, but it takes longer to design. The other thing is that you can have much more detail in a digital design than you'd really want to put in on a hand-painted design. With video screens, the trick is to try and merge the physical set against the digital video screen or LED screens. The problem with this, and it's not quite there yet, is that the video screens are so bright and so intense that unless you have a very good lighting designer, then I think it pulls your eye, the audience eye, into watching what's on the screen rather than what's on the stage. It'll come, we'll get the balance right. There's always going to be a physical element. You're always going to need staircases or platforms or rocks or physical items on stage. Otherwise, it's going to be very flat and very boring. But it's just getting that sort of balance between what's on screen and what's on stage.
And during the process as well, has the way that you work with the other creatives changed in any way in terms of lighting designers and so on? Because again, a lot's changed in lighting in the time that you've been working in theatre, so that relationship is really important still.
Yes, if you've got a good lighting designer, for example, I've been working recently with Jason Taylor, who lit the Coventry Belgrade, and I've known Jason for a long time, and we've worked together on Birmingham Stage Company's Horrible Histories with Jackie Trousdale. And Jason is great because he's old school like myself, but has to embrace all the modern technology. He and I come together, and because we've got such a breadth of knowledge over 40 years, and he's been doing it just the same amount of time as I have, he'll say, look, I think there's this new kit that we can do X, Y and Z with. Let's try that out. I think that'll work. If you paint or colour a floor a certain way, we can make changes during the show with whatever colour and effect. So yes, it is crucial to have a conversation with the LD, the director and the set designer.
I'll tell you what, every time I record one of these podcasts, it makes me realise more and more just how small a world theatre is, because my son's worked for Birmingham Stage for the last 3 or 4 years. He's in rehearsals at the moment for their 3D tour, and we'll go into the West End with them this summer again, and so he's been working with some of the sets that you've designed.
Jackie Trousdale, who's their main designer, she is just terrific, and Jackie and I have worked together for many years, and she'll come, especially when she's asked us to make very complicated props or scenic effects. The latest one was Demon Dentist, where she wanted this really torturous Victorian dentist chair and a few other things, which was great fun to do. But I've made helicopters for them, Egyptian mummy caskets, and just all sorts.
I'll tell you one thing that it's very clear, and that is that you absolutely love what you do, and in particular with pantomime. What is it you most love about working on pantomime every year?
I think it's just a really good excuse to just do something completely fanciful and make an environment that is magical. You said at the beginning of the interview about if there was a careers teacher at school, what you would need as a student to go into theatre design. You just need, obviously you've got to be able to paint and draw, but you've got to have an interest in history, in science, in mechanics, in fabrics, wardrobe, architecture, literally everything. Everything all comes down, and a pantomime actually has all of these elements in it. If I was doing a Bertolt Brecht, say Mother Courage, for example, it's quite specific and quite the opposite to doing a magical kingdom for a pantomime. I'd much prefer having fun with that, with a with doing the witch's lair or the palace interior. Although we've done Brecht, we've done Mother Courage, and I've done loads of Shakespeare's and all sorts, and Broadway musicals, but pantomime seems to be my love, and I don't know why, but I'm still doing it, which is grateful, and I thank the producers who still want me.
Well, it's interesting. I've done a couple of Brechts, including Mother Courage and Shakespeare as well. There aren't as many gags as there are in panto, let me tell you. But what I would say is it fair to say that from your point of view, there are no bounds to your creativity with panto, whereas there'll be restrictions with pretty much everything else you do?
Yes, I mean, as long as it's within realms of reasonable taste, you can get away with anything, really.
And Sleeping Beauty, it is this year. Is that something you're working on alongside other projects as well?
Yes, well, I'm doing Cambridge Arts Theatre. They're undergoing a complete refit at the moment. I do know what the subject is, but I'm on an NDA because I haven't announced it yet. So I'll be doing that, and I'm back on the windy Chroma Pier in North Norfolk to do Summer and Christmas, which is a lovely... in fact, they're doing a refit as well, so we're going back into 2 new theatres. But I'm going to start Coventry next.
Well, you've done so many incredible things, not just in theatre, film and television, but at Buckingham Palace for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee, at the Tower of London, even at the Sizewell nuclear plant as well. And I was talking to Simon Sladen, who's a regular on this podcast series, the senior curator, of course, of modern and contemporary theatre and performance at the Victoria and Albert. And, of course, in the exhibitions there, you can see much of Ian's work. Ian, it's been an absolute pleasure. I wish you all the best for the rest of the year, and in particular for the next panto season. Thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you very much, Martin. It's been a pleasure.
And that's it for now. Don't forget to subscribe to the series where you normally get your podcasts from, and make sure you join me for the next episode when I'll be taking a look around the brand new Imagine Theatre premises as the big move of all the sets and costumes continues. All that coming up next time in episode 99.
Thank you for listening to the latest edition of Just Imagine, the podcast series from Imagine Theatre. And you can find out more by going to www.imaginetheatre.co.uk.